In the past, it was a staple of kidnappings for the hostage to hold up a newspaper to prove that they were still alive. The problem with me is that I started reading the newspapers I was holding up, although I'm still, as you can judge by our social media overlords, in captivity. Nevertheless, I'll try my best to get what news I can out to you given the constraints. First up, stories on the domestic news front that I'm tracking. First up in your daily briefing is a postscript in the news story about the Christian Navy veteran who was charged for tearing down the Satan statue in Iowa. A Christian U.S. Navy veteran has been charged with a hate crime after admitting to beheading the Satanic Temple statue on display at the Iowa State Capitol in December. Michael Cassidy was initially charged with misdemeanor criminal mischief on December 15th, but the Polk County Attorney's Office indicated that the Mississippi man's admission that he destroyed the property because of the victim's Satanic Temple religion prompted the charges to be upgraded to third-degree criminal mischief in violation of individual rights, a Class D felony. While this patriot should be praised for what he did, he was almost immediately excoriated and attacked by his own alleged co-religionists. Many evangelicals and dispensationalists started attacking him for not showing the proper tolerance to an idol of Satan in the state capitol. And of course, what they leave out is the fact that Christianity prevailed in the first place, according to Edward Gibbon in his classic Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, because it was intolerant. In the book, he gives a number of reasons for why Christianity prevailed against paganism. In it we read, "But what were the secondary causes for the rapid growth of the Christian church? It will perhaps appear that it was most effectually favored and assisted by the 5 following causes. 1. The inflexible, and if we may use the expression, the intolerant zeal of the Christians." So Christianity prevailed precisely because it was intolerant of paganism. It was intolerant of idols, as the Ten Commandments tells us to be, that it was intolerant of, kind of demonic gods and Baphomet statues in state legislatures. Today, an example of an intolerant religion is Islam. Islam would not tolerate any kind of offenses to their worldview, their values, their principles. And the Christians used to be like that, and that's why the Christians won. So if the Christians want to go into syncretism and to coexist and to have a new doctrine of tolerance for evil, then they're probably likely historically to lose against a self-assured religion like Islam is. And many other religions, they don't apologize for their beliefs. They don't allow for evil. Like Edmund Burke said that. He said that all it requires for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. And that is essentially what the gospel of tolerance is. It is telling good men to do nothing, to coexist with evil, not to defeat it. And so a lot of people were attacking this brave Christian for doing what Christians did historically. They, kind of tore down the pagan temples. They destroyed Hypatia, who was in Alexandria. That was one of the earliest things that led from antiquity to the Christian period, was when crowds of Christians kind of rose up against Hypatia and the paganism of Alexandria of that time period. And, argue, what may. I mean, I have big problems with people, attacking the Library of Alexandria per se, but that led into the Christian period. It led to the dominance, the conquest of Christendom, and the establishment of what we today call the West. John Stuart Mill, in Considerations on Representative Government, he talks about what is the difference between a republic and a despotism. And he said in a republic, it requires people to be active, like how this patriot was. He actively tore down something that he thought was an offense to his community, to his nation. By the way, the Supreme Court actually ruled about that in a pornography case back in the 70s, that you have to define what is offensive by the community standards, right? And if the community finds something offensive, that community can take that down. They don't have to. There is no one standard policy of ethics or morality that comes from Washington, D.C. or New York or Los Angeles. It's the community. And so it would be interesting to see if the community did vote as to whether it met the community standards to have Baphomet statues in the state legislature. I bet you it wasn't. So it's interesting that nobody is challenging this on Supreme Court ruling grounds. But anyway, so John Stuart Mill, just to get back to that, he said that we have to be active like this guy was, like Kyle Rittenhouse was. A republic calls for active people, and this is why they don't have to have a police state, because the people are, the de facto deputies of law enforcement, of social order, right? Like not celebrating Satan. And this is why the left hates people like Kyle Rittenhouse, because they're artifacts of the older period of the Republic. They are active citizens. And as John Stuart Mill said, he said active citizens vote, they do jury duty, they, participate in their communities. If they see somebody being mugged, they stop the mugging. And he said in despotisms, when they see somebody being mugged, they look the other way and say, oh, it's the police's job, not my job to get involved. And that's how we're being trained now. We're being trained to think that we're just serfs, that we're powerless, and that it's somebody else's job, not our job. And when that happens, when the people are no longer the deputies of law enforcement, now you need a police state. You need much more police. You need many more men with guns, from towers pointing at the crowd to make sure that people don't, abuse and violate each other's, freedoms and stuff. So what and Mill says something interesting. He says, like, what is an active person versus a passive person? He said, an active person, if he sees something wrong with himself, he says, how do I fix it? A passive person, when he sees something wrong with himself, blames someone else. And this is what the children are being, kind of trained in. They're being trained to say, hey, my life isn't going the way I want it to be. It's the patriarchy's fault. My life is in the doldrums. It's because of, systemic racism, and by that method, they're taking the power away from the individual. They're telling them they're powerless, but for kind of the institution that will take care of them, the despotism that will look after them. And we look at the education that they're receiving. There was a recent poll that talked about how 55% of Ivy League graduates believe that the U.S. provides too much individual freedom compared with just 16% of ordinary U.S. voters. So they're getting an education that freedom is bad, it's selfish, it's evil, it's wrong. The states' rights are a secret code, a dog whistle for wanting slavery. So freedom equals evil, evil equals freedom. This is a horrible way to be, and this is how you lose a society. This is how you transition from a free people into a despotism. And on that positive note, we are going into international news. Oil plunges on news that Israel and Hamas may have entered a ceasefire agreement. Qatar has announced that Israel has agreed to the major ceasefire proposal, which has been worked on intensely for over the past week. Qatar has also said that Hamas has issued positive confirmation, according to Al Jazeera. Oil plunged on the news, and amid the first hopeful sign in months that Gaza could witness a breakthrough ceasefire. So why would oil futures and stocks plunge on the possibility of peace in the Middle East? Because that means that there's not going to be scarcity in oil supplies, right? And so scarcity imparts value, like in the 1970s. In 1973, when there was the Arab-Israeli war, it choked off oil supply, energy reserves, and oil went up 4 times in price, and it hurt the entire economy, right? Because energy is built into the price of things, right? Like you need energy to transport those products to the store through, shipping, through the gas that's in trucks, the energy that it requires to keep the factories running to make those products. And so if energy as a component goes up, then the price of everything goes up in terms of the shipping costs and the production costs and everything. But the oil companies make out like bandits. They got 4 times the profit. It's actually 5 times if you read Bill Engdahl's A Century of War. He talks about how it was quintupled. The goal was to quadruple profits. And so right now there were forces that kind of seem to want the same thing, and now they're a little upset that there may be a ceasefire. This may be happening because the U.S. doesn't want a 2-front conflict. They don't want to be mired down in the Middle East as events are happening in the South China Sea. And so they want to have, enough, troops to be able to mobilize to go into East Asia rather than in Western Asia. And so this is kind of touched upon in an article that's about, will China use the supply chain as a weapon? And it says, U.S. officials fear the supply chain is China's secret weapon. Over the last few years, the phrase supply chain has become one of increasing importance to everyone, from corporate leaders to government officials and to customers. Now it's a phrase that is becoming important to even military leaders. According to Barron's, the United States worries that China will use its power in global supply chains as an additional weapon to advance its political and military might, a report released Wednesday showed. The annual threat assessment issued by the Director of National Intelligence said China is already using its supply chain dominance to force foreign companies and countries to transfer technologies and intellectual property to it. We can, of course, thank for this, according to analyst Peter Thiel the NATO agreements that happened after World War II, where the United States basically made a deal. Hey, join us in an alliance and we will kind of hurt our own economy and our own economic interests so that we can have kind of global supply chains. We can build out this global supply chain, and China was integrated into it. Nixon started it in the 70s, kind of making overtures to China, but really in the 1990s was when China was integrated into the global supply chain, and we've been building up their economy. Historically, China has been on the point of starvation for millennia. The only time that they've hit prosperity is when the United States kind of opened up those naval trade routes to them, and China has kind of responded by, acting in terms of its own self-interest, right? And so Machiavelli, I was just walking with my son and we were reading Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. And just to teach him about, kind of Renaissance Italy and philosophy, political science, statecraft. And Machiavelli actually warns that one of the stupidest things you can do is build up somebody else, right? That this leads to your ruin. And he was talking about explicitly Louis the Seventh, I think, in France, and how he entered Italy, he takes over Lombardy, and he starts to build up the church. And this makes many enemies for him. A bunch of the aristocrats are against the church. They want the nation state to be, have primacy. And the church, of course, wants the papacy to have primacy. And there's been these wars that have been going on. Dante writes about it in the Divine Comedy, in the 1200s. And so by the 1500s, Louis comes in. He wants to divorce his wife. So he makes a deal with the Pope, Alexander. And he essentially loses all the territory he gets. Alexander takes over. Cesare Borgia becomes the prince. And that's who Machiavelli is writing the book for, how to acquire territory, how to annex it, and how to keep it. And he warns that one of the dumbest things you can do is make someone else stronger. The quote is, "From this a general rule is drawn which never or rarely fails, that he who is the cause of another becoming powerful is ruined, because that predominancy has been brought about either by astuteness or else by force, and both are distrusted by him who has been raised to power." So the United States essentially violated this rule, right? They built up China, they built somebody else up, and now it's causing problems. Historically, that leads to the ruin of the person who is dumb enough to do that. So that leads us into the news of the weird. Evidently, scientists have now filmed plants talking to each other. According to Nature magazine, imperceptible to us, plants are surrounded by a fine mist of airborne compounds that they use to communicate and protect themselves. Kind of like smells, these compounds repel hungry herbivores and warn neighboring plants of incoming assailants. Scientists have known about these plant defenses since the 1980s, detecting them in over 80 plant species since then. Now a team of Japanese researchers has deployed real-time imaging techniques to reveal how plants receive and respond to these aerial alarms. This was a big gap in our understanding of plant chatter. We knew how plants send messages, but not how they receive them. In this study, Yura Aratani and Takuya Uemura, molecular biologists at Saitama University in Japan, and colleagues rigged up a pump to transfer compounds emitted by injured and insect-riddled plants onto their undamaged neighbors, and a fluorescence microscope to watch what happened. As the Bible said, I marvel at how fearfully and wonderfully I am made. You look out at nature and you see all these amazing defense mechanisms to preserve life. But alas, life cannot be preserved permanently, and that leads us into our obituary segment. Jean Carnahan, the U.S. Senator who succeeded her husband, dies at 90. Former U.S. Senator Jean Carnahan, who became the first female senator to represent Missouri after she was appointed to replace her husband following his death in a plane crash, died January 30th in a hospice center in suburban St. Louis. She was 90. Her family announced the death, but did not provide a cause. Mrs. Carnahan, a Democrat, was appointed to the Senate in 2001 after the posthumous election of her husband, Governor Mel Carnahan, and she served until 2002. Our condolences go out to the Carnahan family during this trying time that they're going through, and I would like to thank you for your time for stopping by and watching the show, or as I like to call it, that suspicious gap in my resume. See you next time. Consider subscribing to my new podcast, Classic Paranormal. It's a clearinghouse for lost real-life accounts of true ghost stories. It's found on Apple Podcasts. Go there now if you're interested in enigmatic tales, chilling true accounts, chronicles from cases of the past that time has forgotten, but that the modern person who likes relaxing by a campfire swapping ghost stories might appreciate. As I said, the new podcast I'm launching is available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and there's a link in the description below on this video.